I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Karen Keifer-Boyd for the invitation to share part of my journey with you all. And I want to thank you all for being here, obviously. And I want to acknowledge those who have made this path for me. Nettie and Frankie, Sadie, Dot, and Pat, who direct me towards the past, and my dear Imsabila and Wangoi, who direct me towards the future. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I begin here with gratitude and by calling out names because genealogies are a central through line and a North Star in my artistic, scholarly, and troublemaking praxis. Creating genealogies demand that we come to understand ourselves, who we are, and who and where we come from. The process of creating genealogies demands that we account for what we know and how we've come to know it. I came to understand the importance of feminist genealogies while at grad school at Penn State. It was at that time I was beginning to be exposed and confronted with contrasting and contradicting materials, ideas, beliefs, and waves of being that chafed at how I understood the world, my place in it, and my relationship to it. Specifically, I remember being asked to write an educational life history. I found that puzzling at first. But it was during this exercise and the unraveling that followed, which allowed me to understand the material relationship between what I was studying theoretically and the role of methods and methodologies in the excavation process, and to why I struggled so much with my place in and relation to my graduate studies. You see, I came to what must be obvious to you all now, a sharp realization about my education. I came to understand my learning had been the key conduit for my assimilation into the logics of white supremacy, sexism and misogyny, class and caste, heteronormativity, ableism, imperialism, and a sort of settler colonial amnesia. On the other side of this realization was that while education had been the source of my learning about and the internalization of knowledge about myself as other, it was also now the location and source of my ability to see things differently and for what they could be. In other words, through this research method exercise, I came to my true feminist consciousness. Maori feminist scholar Linda Tuhuai Smith makes plain the relationship between knowledge, research, and imperialism, and relates the ways in which it has come to structure our own knowing. She argues, the very knowledge gained through our subjugation has been used to subjugate us in ways that Nguoji wa Thiong'o calls the colonization of the mind. During my trip down memory lane, I recalled one of my first clues that things were not as they appeared, just weeks after a group of male faculty created a slideshow of the top 100 artists every painter must know, which included no women, no Black, indigenous, people of color, or any non-Western artists. I found myself in the ladies' room of the painting department at the University of the Arts in 1988 when I encountered a Gorilla Girl poster on the advantages of being a female artist on the stall door. Upon reading it, I felt as though I was having an out-of-body experience, a form of deja vu where I was familiar with what was being said, but it had not yet been discussed with me before. But my real epiphany came while reading the collection Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, and Democratic Futures, edited by Chandra Mohanty and Jackie Alexander. This collection forced me to rethink feminist theories and practices as feminist theories and practices as complex transnational and intersectional frameworks. I was forced to reflect on feminist intellectual and cultural histories, on whiteness. Specifically, the authors argued for a process of looking back that traced the political claims made by marginalized people as a form of embodied solidarity and anti-racist collaboration and coalition building, a form of epistemic disobedience. Frantz Fanon calls this process a returning back over the line, a process of remembering who you are, where you came from, who you are accountable to. In a now famous James Baldwin quote, he states, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And moving back over the line, I found that I was able to name things I had no previous words for, especially in describing my educational life history. I was able to make sense of the specific ways my education was shaped profoundly by the hidden curriculum, the language, architecture, schedules, sartorial negotiations, tax codes, and modalities of teaching, not just what was or was not taught. It was the process of looking back with a feminist intersectional epistemological framework that I was able to understand that sexism, gendered and classed and sexualized violence in school had a history. It was that structural and systemic, and that it was structural and systemic, less about a personal failing. It was where gender was learned, where it was disciplined, and where I fused the process of learning with humiliation, violence, and trauma. And out of that grappling, looking back and letting go, I was able to move back over the line, and I gained a deep love for feminist research methods undergirded by transnational feminist theories, ethics, and creative conceptual frameworks. I became obsessed with an explicitly feminist participatory visual methodology as a way to find alternatives to knowledge production, validation, and truth-telling that was explicitly collaborative, iterative, reflexive, and transformative. A key tenet of feminist epistemology is rooted in social change and transformation. Research that's intentional, that's thoughtful, that's ethical, and oriented towards justice. So in that spirit, I now want to pivot toward a concrete example of what that process looks like in action. As Karen mentioned, I've spent over 15 years living and working in East Africa and in Indian Ocean communities with various collaborators. From 2014 to 2018, I worked with artists, feminist activists, community health advocates, and youth organizers, and my students on a set of interventions regarding maternal mortality. And I have to say, I'm at the College of New Jersey, which is a PWI, a state institution of predominantly undergraduate education. So we do have some master's level programs, but the students I'm talking about as collaborators are undergraduate students. So in a piece of Tanzanian folklore, a mother tells her children, "I am going to the sea to fetch a new baby. The journey is dangerous and I may not return." Giving birth can be a life or death matter for many pregnant women. As a consequence of the high rates of maternal death in many countries, death in childbirth has become to be understood as an unfortunate yet accepted part of the contemporary maternal health landscape. Globally, the high rates of maternal death comprise many overlapping historic and systemic features that are not always easy to disentangle. Adding to the complexity are entrenched approaches to maternal mortality that tend toward one-size-fits-all strategies, approaches that minimize or erase the specificity of local and regional differences. This trend is problematic, as Western biomedical approaches often demand that women perform assigned roles and operate under systems not of their own control or making, ignoring long histories, behaviors, and cultural beliefs that have pre-existed this moment and have supported women's authoritative knowledge as midwives, attendants, mothers, healers. As an intervention into this space, I share an ongoing project, Hakuna Kama Mama, meaning nobody like mama in Swahili, which expands dominant framings by populating the healthscape with localized understandings of maternal health, because African women are far often regarded as the objects of expert knowledge rather than the subjects of their own story. So the Hakuna Kama Mama project I'm going to refer to as HKM for short, centers upon the participants' subjective experiences, subjective perspectives of motherhood in their daily lives, because they are knowledgeable subjects who desire to be seen as capable, responsible experts, as mothers and hardworking contributors to their community. Further complicating this terrain are well-intentioned interventions that tend to mirror the politics and economic interests of international development, which may be at odds with community needs and interests. For example, dominant biomedical framings of maternal mortality in East Africa tend to overemphasize changes women must make in order to reduce maternal mortality. Many popular interventions encourage women to give birth in a hospital setting, but this advice all but overlooks the complex and rational reasons behind women's choices not to give birth in a medical setting. As such, understandings of maternal mortality are most commonly presented in terms of ratios, rates, and numbers. While these data are important as public health indicators, they fail to reflect the important dimensions of the problem. How might we begin to advocate for understandings of maternal death that also include biocultural processes that connect the epidemic of maternal mortality with larger issues of structural and epistemic violence and colonialism? Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous region located 75 kilometers off the coast of mainland Tanzania. Zanzibar is made up of 16 islands, and the two main islands are Unguja and Pemba. HKM was offered in Nungwi, a community at the northernmost tip of Unguja Island. So if you look at the map, you can see Kendwa and Tumbatu, and Nungwi is a little farther north even than Kendwa. Tanzania experiences high rates of maternal mortality, which at the time of the workshop were estimated to be at 554 deaths per 100,000 live births, compared with 19 in the United States. But as we know, these numbers are much higher for Black women. Nungwi, the location of the workshop, experiences some of the highest numbers in Tanzania, but also around the globe. To populate the maternal health scape with a more comprehensive accounting of the barriers to motherhood, the HKM project foregrounds African women's collective knowledge production as a cornerstone in understanding maternal death, as derived from the collective research practice of photo voice. The practice of photo voice through community photography and storytelling processes has resulted in the production of various media. These localized understandings form what I term technologies of resistance. To think through the many entanglements that make up the maternal health landscape in East Africa, one must, as Nigerian feminist scholar Oyeronke Oyumi states, start with Africa. In this case, the project starts with African women and African feminisms. It's important to note, however, that African feminism is not monolithic, rather it's dynamic and fluid. Nigerian feminist scholar Obioma Nameka argues that one must speak in pluralities when talking about African feminisms, because it represents the diversity of approaches, standpoints, and theories emerging from the specificity of localized contexts, historical forces, and cultural imperatives, which can be at times conflicting and at other times complementary and supportive. Furthermore, Nigerian feminist scholar Amina Mama suggests that feminism in Africa is extremely diverse, as it bears the marks of having been forged in diverse colonial contexts, whether it be British, French, Portuguese, Italian, Belgian, or Spanish, and influenced by a multiplicity of civilizations, be it Islamic, Christian, or indigenous, before further being shaped by an array of anti-colonial and nationalist movements. Since independence, feminism in Africa has been diversified by the range of political regimes, be it multi-party, state socialist, capitalist, civilian, or military dictatorship, not to mention the influence of Cold War, various conflicts, and other forms of instability. These descriptions of feminism in Africa provide the rationale for adopting these theories when considering an expanded accounting of maternal mortality, one that centers the intersectional lives, experiences, and well-being of African women. African feminist standpoint theories advocate theorizing from the everyday lived experience of marginal women and make visible the barriers to motherhood as understood by the community that is experiencing a higher than average number of maternal deaths each year. In order to build this knowledge and access women's rich experiences with motherhood, we adopted the photo voice method. Photo voice is a participatory action research method that emerges from feminist standpoint and situated knowledges on the premise that people are experts of their own lives. Photo voice method employs photography and storytelling to raise critical questions and to address issues of power imbalances in research. In communities grappling with historical inequities and overlapping oppression, observational research by outsiders significantly skews findings and leads to inaccurate views of community, its assets, values, and needs. Participants used photo voice to define how they wanted to be represented inside and outside the community and the country. Such an approach might enable us to address more thoughtfully the issues of equity Such an approach might enable us to address more thoughtfully the issues of equity and structural as well as epistemic violence in maternal health care. This project was co-conceived and a proposal was submitted to the Zanzibari International Film Festival's Women Panorama program to offer a formal workshop. The mechanisms for funding this workshop included direct support from my home academic institution, student fundraising, as well as the Mikangudi Youth Organization and the Panorama Program funds. Together, we mutually agreed on a budget and who would cover what aspects of the budget and how. 10 undergraduate students joined me. The group was ethnically and racially diverse. All but one were females from different academic departments, ranging from a first year to a senior class status. They all had a semester of informal Swahili language study, photo voice research training, and solar installation training. The group spent 3 weeks before the Hakuna Kama Mama workshop installing solar lighting in maternal health clinics in 4 different communities, including Masai land on the Tanzanian mainland and Unguja and Pemba Islands. Each of these clinics delivered more than 100 babies a month and either had no electricity or experienced significant energy insecurity. The solar installation experiences provided students with the critical clinic and community experiences in vastly different contexts, from semi-urban to rural indigenous communities in the lead up to the Hakuna Kama Mama workshop. Our local partners on the ground included the Zanzibar International Film Festival, a well-respected arts festival that brings the entire East African region together through film and offers the wider community a variety of workshops, arts, music, and cultural events over the course of 9 days. As an NGO, the Zanzibari International Film Festival, or ZIF, serves as a catalyst for social and economic development. To meet this goal, ZIF has created a number of panorama programs, women, youth, and community. These community-based programs in select rural communities offer programming on specific topics each year and has used the platform of the Women's Panorama to highlight and address pertinent gender and social issues. The panorama, therefore, becomes a medium of women's power and visibility. The Women's Panorama commonly comprises of a series of workshops, seminars, and symposia organized and centered on the visibility of women in and through the medium of cinema, arts, and the media. We joined together to offer the workshop in Nungwi, and this was the very, very first time in the then 15-year history of ZIF that the Panorama program was offered in this particular community, due in large part to the proximity of Nungwi being so far from the main center of the festival location, but it was also coupled with past reluctance of Nungwi community members to align themselves with the festival. They questioned the value of such a festival to the community and what kind of development it necessarily would bring. Nungwi has been deeply impacted by a glut of international tourism and resulting environmental degradation and stagnant economic growth leading to prostitution and child labor, a slow pace of development manifested in a lack of running water, electricity, refuse collection, and indoor plumbing, as well as a variety of cultural changes. So despite these apprehensions, the coordinator of Women Panorama sought and was granted permission by the community to host the workshop. The participants were recruited and selected by the Panorama coordinator, and all participants were compensated for their participation in the workshop for funds that I secured in the US. In advance of the workshop, 120 participants were accepted into the workshop, more applied than could be accommodated. So we also partnered with a youth organization, the Mikunguni Youth Organization, or MIDO, who were chosen for their organizational goals and expertise, as well as the large number of young women who were active members. Most of these women spoke Swahili, Arabic, and English. And before the workshop, my students hosted a training for them, and they provided a session on Zanzibari history, culture, and customs for us. All of the participants were informed of the itinerary for the 3 days. Verbal and written consent was requested from all. They were reminded that their participation was voluntary and they were free to withdraw from the workshops at any point. None did, and more people joined, which is another story. Essentially, we had workshop participants that range in age from 16 to 68. And while most of them were women, mostly young women or older women, we did have a few men, mostly young men or older men. And we held the workshops in the school during their summer break. And so over the course of 3 days, the participants photographed, sang, discussed, wrote, created, and imagined together. We worked in large groups, small groups, they worked individually. Most of the time, the groups were split into 3 smaller subgroups of approximately 40 participants. Throughout the workshop, participants wrote short stories and they took more than 600 photographs. On the final day, the participants co-curated a public exhibition to which the community was invited. The participants also requested that members of the local hospitals, maternal and public health NGOs be invited. It was also decided that the exhibition should be shared with people outside of Zanzibar, including the US. As we collectively worked to organize the exhibition, a few significant themes emerged. 1, space, power, and autonomy. 2, respect. 3, resilience. The results of their envisioning concluded with the group describing their media creations as technologies of resistance. Localized knowledge about barriers to safe motherhood were produced collectively and designed to expand and shift the narrative regarding maternal death to one that centers their expertise and sees them as smart, capable, and loving experts and contributors to their community, along with calls for greater accountability for those who typically are empowered to improve women's conditions. The goal of the exhibition was to reach and teach community members, policymakers, and those in positions to make effective, informed change, rooted in the needs, interests, and experiences of the participants. African geographer James Ferguson has described the concept of a place in the world as a categorical system in which countries and geographical regions have their place, as understood as both in space and a rank and a system of social categories, as in the expression, knowing your place. This includes bodies made synonymous with the places being located in the same categorical space. By centering our workshop to begin with Zanzibari women in their community, we begin to challenge the concept of African women's place in the world. Taking a cue from Nigerian feminist Oyewumi, we measured the impact of dominance of gender constructs, especially as it relates to gendered spaces. The space of the workshop itself symbolized something very significant to the participants. Outside of weddings or other cultural or religious festivals, the opportunity for women to meet as a group like this was rare, let alone talk about something of feminist importance to them personally and collectively. The very act of hosting the workshop, of physically making space to talk about motherhood, is a form of resistance to patriarchal and religious norms that shape the day-to-day lives of participants. Space is a critical dimension and is an often overlooked feature in maternal health interventions. It is easily reducible to location, stripped of history and significance. Many of the participants' photos and comments highlighted the space of the hospital and clinic as being a site of verbal and physical abuse, of class and race-based discrimination, and of detention, overcrowding, abandonment, and extortion. These descriptions of the clinic or hospital as a site or a space of abuse were very common throughout the workshop. The participants identified the space of the clinic as producing many issues that led to their being unable or unwilling to see it as a safe and empowering location. For some participants, the evocation of space and power was connected to the cultural and religious practices that women were expected to leave at the door of the clinic. The participants registered frustration that they were expected to let go of deeply held beliefs, practices, and values when visiting a clinic or a hospital. For example, in a Muslim community in which strict adherence to gender segregation is critical, the dominance of male doctors had been problematic for many women and their families, especially for their husbands, fathers, brothers, who may well have complete control over a woman's ability to leave their home and pay for prenatal visits. These aspects of care, who is expected to make concessions and compromises, who has power, who is blamed, were a much repeated refrain. For instance, one participant took pictures of the clinic's waiting area. Another took a picture in which she titled, "No Privacy." She attempted to highlight the Muslim virtue of al-haya, of modesty and shyness as it relates to maternal health care. Our discussions about why many participants chose to stay at home to deliver against the advice of experts. Some spoke of distance and costs, while others spoke about overcrowding at clinics and hospitals where, except when delivering, you could expect to share a bed with at least one other woman in a room with several beds. Many preferred the privacy and modest comfort of their own homes, even if it meant returning immediately to their domestic responsibilities. The overrepresentation of men in obstetric care in Zanzibar is deeply connected to the legacy of colonialism. However, the tensions regarding midwives and traditional birth attendants in Zanzibar started much earlier. Various stereotypes have negatively influenced care, and these were solidified by British colonialism, in which racial and class-based hierarchies determined the provision of care. Clinics and hospitals in Zanzibar were segregated well into the 1950s. Prior to British rule, midwives in Zanzibar had been exclusively women, and they were held in high esteem as sources of knowledge and authority. However, the use of midwives was made illegal, and they were dismissed in favor of male doctors, who therefore claimed authority over women and their bodies. Through their stories of abuse, participants revealed the legacy of these practices and connected the participants' maternal health-related experiences to deeper historical genealogies. The participants voiced their interest in more female doctors, and also in doctors who had received good training, who could relate to the people and the environment. When pressed to define what it meant to have good training, participants emphasized cultural and religious values that were important to the indigenous people of Nungwi, and they were especially concerned with the act of being treated with respect. For many participants, an opportunity to speak their minds about their physical and social location was significant. Many religious and cultural practices, such as al-haya and power relations, make it impossible for women to challenge the authority of a doctor without significant consequences. Mariamu's photo, named Mama Nzito, engages the subject of her photo directly. Instead of covering her face or looking down as al-haya practices dictate, her subject looks directly into the camera while sitting in her home. This may not seem like a radical image to viewers outside this community, but the sharp distinctions that demarcate private and public space rest at the door of the home. It should also be noted that Nungwi is a desirable tourist location. As such, women in Nungwi often find themselves as the object of a foreign photographer's gaze, and pictures of them are taken and circulated without their consent. The power that comes with the ability to take photographs, to direct the lens where she would like it, to allow us to see the world as she does, is a radical act that was not lost on the Kunakama Mama participants. The space of HKM allowed participants to speak back in a way that was safe, but no less transformative. The themes of space, power, and authority captured the conversations, and nearly 100 photographs emerged of varying home conditions, including images of pregnant participants or community members engaged in very physically demanding domestic labor. For example, one participant stated, Doctors should be made to visit and see our everyday life conditions. So for some of the workshop's photographers, the goal of producing real representations of what their lives truly looked like meant taking photographs that were not staged or posed. In preparation for the workshop, I spoke to many of the public health advocates in Zanzibar about top issues in reducing maternal death. Yet not once did any mention the doctors, nurses, or clinic spaces. However, in every single group activity, the participants expressed concern about the behavior and ethics of those in charge of offering medical care. All of the groups touched on what they felt was lacking in the care they received. For example, from one of our speak outs about how we might address issues relating to discrimination by doctors, nurses, and public health staff, participants made the following statements. They should do their job. They should like to do their job. They should be honest. They should treat people with love and understanding. I want to be treated with respect. Clinics and hospitals are not necessarily safe spaces for pregnant and delivering mothers. The demands for respect also pertain to verbal and physical violence the participants reported receiving at the hands of clinic and hospital staff. A few participants spoke of being handled aggressively, slapped, and yelled at. Clearly, this type of behavior presents serious risks to safe delivery. Most of the participants had assisted in more than 5 births, yet they were not seen as resources resources by the medical professionals and the public health advocates in their communities, despite the acute shortages of trained medical staff. Like poor women elsewhere, women in Nungwi have been conventionally regarded as the objects of expert knowledge rather than the subjects of their own. So to conclude, HKM highlights how efforts that focus solely on obstetric care in a clinical setting do little to resolve maternal death, let alone account for what informs women's choices and their ability and autonomy to make them. I've shared examples from a modest community-based project, African feminist intervention into maternal health, specifically maternal mortality, that seeks to challenge development agencies and the experts who impose Western categories and technical knowledge that displace local knowledge and expertise. The workshop and the resulting conversations have revealed that many women are willing to forego expert treatment at medical facilities because these biomedical spaces assign roles to expectant mothers, force them to cooperate under conditions not of their own making, and ignore the history, behaviors, and cultural beliefs that have supported them as mothers. In other words, women are being forced to give birth in unsafe medical places, and this is not just a matter of subjective feeling. Zanzibar's main hospital suffers from extremely high rates of death in its facility. In addition to goals of this discussion has been to place the technologies of resistance, the media productions of the participants into a bigger context, thus situating the conversations about motherhood and awareness of the problems that mothers face, and concretely linking them to poor maternal outcomes. HKM does so by asserting that African women's voices and experiences must be at the center of maternal mortality interventions if they are to be successful. Localized contexts are important because they are differently embodied, varied, disparate, and speak to the subjectivities that shape maternal health in their community. This project understands African feminist frameworks as providing the grounds for interrupting ahistorical, generalizing, essentializing, culturalist, racializing discourses which have categorized people according to flattened out gendered and racial categories and hierarchies. African feminist work has challenged unitary notions of culture and contested images and representations of the essentialized cultural other. It is therefore crucial for challenging and adding to the dominant knowledge of and approaches to maternal mortality. In addition to being a useful approach in the context outlined here, the adoption of African feminist epistemologies has a lot to offer beyond localized context, as the results of these workshops attest. Further, the participants' work reveals power gradients between patients and healthcare workers and within biomedical discourses. In part, the creative media outputs created by the participants have complicated the victim narratives and serve as a corrective to the overrepresentation of African women as hapless victims. The latter perspective has robbed them of their agency and in turn led to the devaluation of African women's experiences, especially their acts of resistance. The construction of African women as lacking the capacity to create knowledge is a legacy of colonialism that has paved the way for neo-colonializers to advance racist and sexist thinking. This perspective has allowed women to be stripped of their authority, their decision-making abilities as midwives and as healers, and has led to the nullification of women as resources and solving problems they face. The participants requested we invite guests to the final presentation, and that we continue to share the maternal health data we collected in Nungwi as a way to create a space for rural communities in Zanzibar to speak out about and represent with authorship their experiences and perceptions of motherhood. We have fulfilled our promise by hosting an exhibition of images and words at a gallery on our campus. And more than 200 people attended on opening night. Ultimately, HKM is meant to be a platform for the public health sector and various others to access the data and improve understandings with the intention of using these research findings to coordinate future projects. More specifically, the reframing and claiming of knowledges and the space of in this project will work to actively impact the quality of health services in the area and provide a critical lens for better analysis of outside health interventions. In this way, the participants are making demands and telling stories through resistive technologies embodied in photo voice practices. In this way, the Tanzanian folklore shared at the beginning of this presentation is remade, and the return for women becomes possible. So I share this particular research project as an example of my own educational life history, and what it meant to sort of cultivate a feminist research praxis that allowed me to see how this functions outside of just art education or educational spaces in general, but that it could be applied widely in a transnational context. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, thank you.
I'll just like make some sound here too. Thank you, Marla.
Pretty close to 40, I think.
Okay, and we have 10, maybe a little bit more, but about 10 minutes. We'll start with Christine at about 8. But would you, do you want to stop sharing your screen and then you can see everyone as well? I think I'm going to put the record on.
Karen, good evening, everyone. It feels very special to come back. It is an honor to be invited to come back and speak to everyone here tonight. I remember my first GRAE, it was in 2005 when I first came to Penn State, and that year there was the first GRAE. And I have been participated in GRAE until I graduated in 2011. So 2011 probably is the last year I participated. And last time I was a graduate student presenting at GRAE, Graham was the respondent. So it felt very special to also see Graham here today. And thanks everybody for coming tonight. I want to especially thank Dr. Keifer-Boyd, my advisor, for her continuing support in my research journey. And also want to thank for this opportunity to reflect on my research journey although I didn't think that I have something super interesting to share. But I think everyone here has a different research agenda. So I don't know how much it will be useful to tell you about my research, but I think it might be helpful to also share my struggle and how I navigate the journey. Maybe some people, especially graduate students or international students, can be inspired by this experience. So let me share my screen. So hopefully you can see it now. So I was invited to talk about my research from dissertation to current work. People are talking about you need to have a research narrative. I think if I have a research narrative, it will look like a science fiction. I teleport from one place to another place, from real world to virtual world, or vice versa, and back and forth. I think my research map is all over the place, and you have to use wormhole to travel to different places. This might not be an accurate usage of the term, but what I mean was that they are very different, distinct between virtual and real. So that's the metaphor I want to use to describe my research journey. And that's also the reason I choose this background today for the Zoom meeting. So I want to provide a context first. I was an international student. I am from Taiwan. Can everybody hear me? All right, so I'm from Taiwan, and I got my master's degree in Taiwan and was an elementary school art teacher before I came here for my PhD. And this picture is me going to the Statue of Liberty, the year I came here to study. So it was 15 years ago. And I was so excited to be here as an international student. And so my experience might be different from many other international students. I don't want to just generalize, but maybe some of the international students share a similar struggle that I had. I had struggled with English, and I'm still struggling with it nowadays. I need to say this in advance. I apologize if there's anything I said feels difficult to understand today. Because of the coronavirus, I have not had much chance to talk in English since March. Like everybody, I spent much of the time at home, and don't have much chance to talk in English. So I feel like my ability to speak English has declined a little bit, maybe a lot. Probably because I'm not exercising the mouth muscles that I need to use for English speaking. So I consider this problem with struggling in language is a weakness, because as an academic, you need to write English. You are expected to write in good English. But maybe the problem is not just my English, it's the way I process and use language, or the way I use language to communicate. I was told by my master's thesis advisor in Taiwan that my writing style was too oral, which was, I wrote my master's thesis in Chinese. Anyways, when you are in the US and you are doing your degree, you really are expected to have good writing, good English skill. So if you're not able to do this, you are missing an important element of becoming an academic. So I know my weakness, but I might have some strength too. At least I hope. So, but what is my strength? Find out when I came here. So despite knowing the weakness, I came to the US to study anyways. I'm not sure where.
Christine, did you mean to be sharing your screen because it no longer is being shared?
No, I will switch back and forth.
Okay, as long as, okay, great, thanks.
I'm not sure where I have this strength to come here, but I did it anyways. I think I was hoping I would improve with the time went by, although this might not be 100% accurate. So fast forward to the time when I was starting my dissertation. By the way, I can tell you, you can feel relieved. This is not my dissertation defense, so I'm not planning to tell a lot about the theories and such and forth. I'm not planning to discuss the content in depth, but I think you will be more interested to learn how I turned my struggle or my weakness into my strength in doing my dissertation. Just for the sake of some background information, my dissertation is about avatar and identity construction. I have been interested in technology and identity since I was in college. So about 10 to 12 years ago, an online virtual world called Second Life was popular. And I will share here that, so this is my avatar on the left of the screen at the time. And if you don't know much about Second Life, this is the homepage right now. You can see, and you can maybe see a few pictures here to just get an idea, get a sense of what avatars in Second Life look like right now, nowadays. So back to that time, it was the most sophisticated system for people to make their avatar in 3D graphic format. And I think it's still so today. But by the way, I have not been using Second Life for a couple of years because I'm doing other research. But because of doing this presentation, I did a quick Google search and something popped up with question like, is Second Life still a thing? And there's an article pointing out Second Life still has many dedicated users in 2020. And seeing this, it's particularly feel interesting, especially during this pandemic time, everybody's at home. And so this is a little bit off topic, but not sure how many of you have heard of Nintendo's new video game on Switch called Animal Crossing: New Horizons. It came out in March and quickly became one of the best-selling video games for Nintendo. And it is something like a virtual world too, because there's really no end goal for a regular video game. So I have seen people getting married in this video game and during the quarantine time. And I also heard people are doing political campaigns in Animal Crossing. Anyways, what I want to say is that virtual world, so no matter in what format, no matter how it evolved, how the graphic looked like, Animal Crossing looked like a kid's game, but there's actually a lot of adults playing it. Virtual world is continuing attracting people for many different reasons. And as long as virtual world exists, avatars continue to be important in virtual world. So just for those of you who have never heard of Second Life, I just showed that, and you just need to know that I just showed the homepage, but it's not really how. When you go into Second Life, you need to use a specific client client program to log in. So I'm not able to show you, but what I want to share here, I apologize for the mess here, is that. Sorry, I lose my thought. What I want to share here is, so at the time of doing research, I was interested in the implication of creating avatar in a virtual world, which mirrors the real world. So my dissertation was focusing on theorizing avatar construction in the virtual world. And of course, research is hard, and I wasn't sure what my strength was. But I know I have a lot of weakness. So when you are doing research, you want to be as familiar and know as much as possible about the thing you are researching. So I spent time wandering around Second Life as an avatar back then. I tried to figure out how I feel in different kinds of avatars. I was a human, a woman, an animal, and a lot of different things. And there was a day I was an old lady and wandering into a fashion store selling sexy women's clothes. So this picture, what I show here, is that old lady avatar I had. And next to the avatar is this so-called pose stand in Second Life, is how you change your clothes and change your pose. And in that woman's clothing store, you can see on the picture, sell super sexy women's clothes. And probably because I was an old avatar, it was difficult to tell my gender. And what happened next became a turning point for me in my dissertation process. So I was ejected from the store. So ejected in Second Life means that you were kicked out of the place. And I wasn't doing anything there. I was just standing there. So I was surprised, but I was also not so surprised that my appearance was how people judged me in the virtual world. So anyways, I decided to write about the story, and not just write about it, but create an online dialogue kind of writing, talking to my avatar. I was inspired by arts-based research, specifically the novel format dissertation, Scene Read by Pauline Samishima. If research can be presented as a novel, it can become more easily accessible. So I think, why can't I do that? And this has become the starting point of how I used dialogue in my writing. So I developed a storyline for my dissertation based on the online chat dialogue with a fictional character, and the rest are history. So here's an example of the dialogue between me and the fictional character in my dissertation. I think what is significant about my development of dialogue style research writing is that first, it's a reflection of the online environment in which people chat. When I was in college in the 90s, it was the early days of the internet. So I did online chatting all the time. And this has become part of my experience with the internet. And it has become a nature for me to communicate using online chatting style. So I have to say it is different from today's style back then. I believe that knowledge can be generated through dialogues. And I think dialogue style writing is easy for me to reflect on my own experience and my thought. Because when I reflect on something, I ask myself questions. And in dialogue or chat, you ask questions a lot, and you have to ask questions so the other person can respond. And people like my advisor, Karen, who have worked with me, can tell you that I usually have a hard time writing the beginning part of the article. I couldn't get my thoughts straight. And I think dialogue has put me in the context of a story, and it also helped provide questions for me to answer. So it helped me to communicate my thought. I believe dialogue is the way to avoid jargon and make your work more easily accessible. And in dialogue, you have some sort of storyline, and people love stories. So using dialogue style writing is my way of storytelling. So I think because of these developments, I turned my weakness into my strength for my dissertation. So I think people like me who are struggling with writing in traditional academic writing style, dialogue is a different choice to represent your research. So you need to find your strength. Dialogue style doesn't have to be fiction, but I choose to make it fiction because I believe, and I quote Patricia Levy, fiction grants us an imaginary entry into what is otherwise inaccessible. So I'm gonna stop sharing now, just talk a little bit. So what do I do after a dissertation? So fast forward, I was a newly graduate PhD. And what do you do after dissertation? You know, I always wondering back then. So I don't just like to talk about my research one after another. I feel like it might be more helpful to provide a little bit context. So I can tell you that I struggled after graduation. My university, which UNCW, didn't have an art education program, but you can start one. So that's what I did. So now we have an art education master's MAT program. Although it doesn't mean that you cannot do research in art education, it makes it a little bit more difficult. On the other hand, I'm lucky to be in a place that allows me freedom to do research. And some people might be concerned about how their research topic affects their tenure process. I think that's something very real with after you graduate and you be in a new faculty. But because there are so many disciplines in the place I work in college of education, nobody really cares about what research you do and give me a lot of freedom, and because I was the only art educator there. So I was able to be creative and experience with many different things. I think at this point, after you graduate, many things come into becoming a factor influencing your research, and depends on where you are. I am, or I was, at a master institution, which means that a university is a teaching-focused university, and there are not much time or resources for research, although things has been changing in recent years there. No matter what, there's no doubt that you need to continue to do research. So the environment, the institution, and the teaching all have an impact on my research. And I tried many things and jumped around. So I heard from many people that I need to build on what I have done to create a research narrative. So one of the first things I did after graduation was to publish based on my dissertation. But this is not enough, you know, you need to have new research too. So I juggled between being a new faculty and teaching new classes and having to do research. and bumped around trying different things. My environment was very different from when I was a graduate student at Penn State. As an educator doing research in my own classroom is the first thing, it's a natural thing for me to do. However, being interested in technology, I had limited access to provide computers to students in classroom. Even at the time, it's about like 8 years ago, we didn't have a reliable Wi-Fi in classroom. So I can check out some laptops from the technology union, but students cannot get on Wi-Fi in classroom. So continuing doing internet and technology related research in my own classroom is challenging. But of course, things have since changed. I don't think I set a good example, but I think using my failure as an example can tell you that it is okay to fail. And you might learn something from it. I learned a lot from my own experience. So I want to talk about a few examples of failures. Of course, I need to say that the definition of failure might be different from person to person. So I decided to switch direction and research something related to the class I teach. So I teleport back from the virtual world and walked into a real school classroom. So doing research in school is very different. Doing research in schools, you have to get approval from local school district, and there's lots of paperwork and bureaucracy you need to work through. Anyways, I started researching how teachers in elementary school integrate arts and how art teachers using technology in their classroom. But again, I gave up, even after I spent much time in school. I feel like I don't have enough motivation to continue. So after that, I think maybe I'm still interested in virtual world, but in different virtual world. So after some research in the real world led to a dead end previously, I thought I found a balance point between the virtual world and the real world. So I worked with a middle school art teacher and observed her teaching in Minecraft. The research focused on using Minecraft to teach STEAM. I think Minecraft is still popular nowadays, but maybe a few people know that I have done research in Minecraft because I never published my research. But I did finish my research this time and presented my research at an AEA a couple of years ago. I think deeply there's still not enough motivation for me to continue, write it up and publish it. I think for me, motivation is one of the most important things to publish and to push me to work. So although at the beginning I said these examples are failures, but what I mean is that they didn't live long and some were not even finished. But these experiences are important to me. I learned a lot about research in the classrooms. They helped me map out my research map. I just put a not accessible sign on them, at this time. And perhaps they taught me that I should have listened to the advice earlier about building on my own dissertation research. So how do I build on my dissertation research? Anyways, as a newly graduated PhD, it's a good idea to follow the advice and build on the dissertation unless the process tortures you so much that you hate your dissertation and you will throw it away. So I actually did not follow the advice until a couple years into my work. And one of the things I did follow the advice was to create an online chat game based on my dissertation. So again, I'm gonna show you an image. Do it again. Okay, so I created this game. So how did I create this game? I created this interactive dialogue game using dialogue in my dissertation as a base. So I had been wanting to do this since I was doing my dissertation. And when I saw there's a call for paper on digital scholarship, and by the way, Penn State faculty Erin Kanoko is one of the co-editors for that special issue. I know this is what I want to do. So I went back to a virtual world immediately while I was doing so when I was doing my dissertation, I thought of creating a video game, but the idea did not realize. I think dialogue style writing is a great candidate for message chatting style game. I'm gonna show you a little bit of what this game looked like. So basically, this is how you start a game, and I explained this game. And when you get started, you choose an avatar, and it tells you like the beginning of the story, and then you answer a message. So you start popping up and chatting to this character, and you choose between different dialogues, and different dialogues will lead to different questions next screen, so on and so forth. So so this is how basically it's like an online chatting style game. Nowadays, even my car registration is using like smartphone message chatting environment. When I log into NCDPI, it pop out just like your phone message, and it asks you what you want to do and guide you through the registration process. So inspired by this kind of message chatting and other chatting games, I created a game to mimic the message chatting on the phone. So I used Twine to create this game. I start with the dialogue from my dissertation, but I had to reorganize those dialogues and create new dialogues. So the dialogues were hyperlinked, making it's just like a complex web. This is a picture, how I link those many different dialogues in the game. Dialogue makes it possible to cut the information into short pieces. And what the short piece, with these short pieces, it's possible to create different versions of the story. And so this means that I have gone through many different scenarios. So if I choose to answer a question, like I said, the next question will be different. And so there are so many different combinations. In fact, I don't know how many different combinations it will come out playing this game. If somebody better at math maybe can tell me. But this is exciting to me because this means that there can be many different versions of my research, just like parallel universe. While every readers go through a different journey, and the ending point or what I want to communicate is the same. And this is what a two-dimensional dissertation cannot do. So I think entering the area of quantum computing, this is what digital scholarship could look like. So at the end, I think this project allows me to realize an idea I had for a long time. The online game was great. I consider it a milestone piece for me personally. And I followed advice and built on my dissertation. But although I do want to continue this kind of research, I'm still very interested in thinking about how to use game elements to represent research. I only have 24 hours a day. And so speaking about representing research, one thing I also interested is data visualization. So extending from my interest in technology, I also started research about STEAM education. I was able to play around STEAM through the course I teach on arts integration and another course on STEAM curriculum. I'll show you like 2 pictures of some of the project I did. I was planning with Makey with students for the STEAM activity, doing STEAM project. And also like 3D printing and doing like stop motion animation. So I have published a few articles on STEAM, but I want to mention more specifically about one ongoing project I said ongoing, although it has been paused for a while. I do plan to come back and continue. I have been doing data visualization for STEAM curriculum since 2015. I set out a goal to sort out a discussion about STEAM curriculum because I see so many different approaches towards STEAM curriculum, and they somewhat create confusion for teachers. So I visualize the data to represent different STEAM approaches using content analysis as a research method. And an earlier result was published in a book chapter, but I'm not completely satisfied with it. I continue to develop data visualization, and this is what I developed in 2018 to visualize different STEAM curriculum. And so I do continue to keep working on it in the next few years, and hopefully I'll produce more publications. And so I'm going to stop sharing here and go back to talk a little bit. So far I talked about using dialogue and create a game and doing data visualization to represent research. And so the next destination on my journey is a very different kind. And this time is in real world and a very different kind of representation. So just let's imagine from here, I teleport back to the real world again. So how do I go from virtual to real world? You might be surprised that the longest continuing research I did after this station is not in virtual world. And if you know me a little bit, you might be even more surprised about my next research journey. It's related to dance. So people know me might think that you're crazy, you're clumsy, how can you dance? So I'm not good at dance, but I like the art form since I was in college. And since I'm teaching not only visual art, but also dance, music, and drama, I pay a lot of attention to different art forms. And so in Wilmington, one of my favorite events is the film festival called Keyfer-Boyd. So Wilmington used to be a town with many movie productions until a couple years ago, the state legislature killed the industry here. But the film festival is still going on every year. I think it has been running 20-something years. Although this year it might be a little bit different, it might be virtual. So on the opening night of the film festival, there's a tradition to have a performance combining dance and film. So I went to see the performance when I first learned about the event. And it has been every year since I first did it. I never imagined I would end up dancing at a conference last year because of watching this performance. So after seeing the performance the first time, I immediately wanted to introduce this art form to my students. And it happened that one of my colleagues is one of the dancers on the stage. And by the way, he teaches in a higher education program, not in the theater department. So I remember it was toward the end of the semester after I watched the performance. The festival is in November. And I had the chance to talk to my colleague in the college holiday lunch gathering. I told him that I saw his performance and loved art form in the performance. I asked him if it's possible he can come to my class next semester to work with my students for a creative movement workshop. So as I said, I teach dance integration in my course, but I can't dance. So I often invite people with the experience to come to my class. And at the beginning of the new semester, I contact my colleague again, and he happened to be teaching a social justice in education graduate course last semester. So we decided to collaborate. I told him my goal is to have my students try dancing with film, the film they make, to understand how they can use their body to interact with the virtual. So I'm interested in this aspect because I have done something similar using Second Life Machinima with Karen in NAEA years ago. By the way, if you don't know what Machinima is, it's using existing video games or virtual world to create like animation films. So at the beginning of the semester, I didn't even imagine that it was going to be turned into a full stage performance. My goal was to understand how students create movements interacting with the screen. So my initial idea was to have like a short performance in the classroom at the end of the semester. But as we planned our collaboration, idea of creating a public performance at the end of the semester emerged. I was a little scared at the time, to be honest. This was out of my comfort zone, even if I was not a person dancing on the stage. I'm not a stage person, and I'm in visual art, not performing arts. So I have no experience teaching people to dance on stage. And I can imagine this is out of my students' comfort zone too. But for any unknown reason, we did it anyway. With the carefully planned workshops and collaboration with graduate students, we ended up producing the first performance of social justice event. We had workshops on social justice and movements and invite professionals to provide feedback after the rehearsal. So we didn't know at the time that it would turn into even bigger event in the next 2 years. Just give you a little bit idea of what the stage will look like. So this is like the performance of the very first performance of social justice event. And so the following year, the project evolved into more complex collaboration projects and become a very complicated project involving students' collaboration across different levels. So the first year we have graduate student, undergraduate student collaboration. In the second year, we invited the local high school and high school IB dance students become the dancers. And my undergraduate students are the filmmakers. And in the third year, we expanded to involve middle school students. So middle school students become the dancers, and the high school students become the choreographers and taught the dance to the middle school students. And so my undergraduate students were still filmmakers because this is what falls into visual arts. And in some way, it also involved elementary school students because some of my students interviewed elementary school students in some of their videos. So by the third year, the project basically connects students in all levels, from elementary to middle to high school to undergraduate and graduate. The focus of the performance is to advocate social justice issues in education. So we put students in groups to research and learn about different groups of people in their struggle. So the graduate students act as mentors for undergraduate students. And undergraduate students took what they learned and researched and create a film about a topic. So after finishing the film, they create movements for the performance with the film. And since this is a complicated process, it is usually very difficult to explain what we do to people. So we have a lot of challenge every year, you know, from funding to school support to timing to equipment, etc. So for example, we have encountered a school administrator who questioned teaching middle school students about social justice is not safe. So I want to show you, there's a couple more pictures of the performance on stage throughout the years. But I want to show you a short video clip of my students' performance. So you get a sense of what the performance looked like. So here, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in identity and technology. I think movement is enacting identity. While students perform different identities, their body and their own identity is interacting with different identities. Coupled with the event or the identities in the virtual space on stage, students will provide a unique opportunity to exist in a flow of real, assumed, and virtual identities, and to reflect on the intersection of these identities and question in the segregated and fragmented identity in the real world. And of course, this is only one way to frame this project. And this is where I started. But I also see these projects about many things, such as collaboration and activism. So how do I end up dancing? So the project's been spent 3 years, and during each year we collected data, and my colleague and I were thinking about sharing our collaboration process through research. So we asked about collaboration in the performance making process is entangled, pedagogical, and receptacle. Because of this project, it's mostly performing art project, my colleague and I decided to use arts-based and performative inquiry as a research methodology. So we scheduled regular meetings and started to have communication related to the collaboration. Then we decided to respond to each other's artwork. I started with a drawing, and my colleague talked about his thought on the drawing related to our collaboration. And we ended up writing poems. Then we created a short dance performance to communicate the research result of our collaboration. So the next video I want to show you, I apologize if you feel like seeing too much video, is the dance we created for our research. So one way I see how this project evolved is through Karen Barra's theory of interaction. It means that I didn't see myself planning to do the project independently. It's also not just the interaction between me and my colleague or me and my students. Instead, we researched our project, and you know, it involved the research is enacted from within the relationship between my colleagues, students, and art form, and technology, etc. And so that's how I come back from the virtual world in dancing in the real life stage. So looking back on my trail, what influenced my choice of research, I can see that I'm interested in alternative representation and communication. I can see that I was bored by the traditional research. So I gave up and see them as a failure in my early career. I think alternative representation takes more time and energy to plan, but it is so much more rewarding for me. I still write traditional style research papers, although research is never easy. These traditional styles more straightforward. But I think my heart still prefers alternative representation. It requires creativity and careful planning, but I think it's rewarding. And I hope someday I'll be able to ditch the traditional writing. But this also depends on the change of academic environment. So what is my newest adventure and where do I go from here? I actually was planning to go to the other side of the earth. So I still wear the identity of being international, although I'm not a student anymore. So doing work that would connect people internationally interests me. So last year, my colleague and I went a grant to do research using art to connect people in our lab school and students in Japan. And our lab school serves low-income and high-need students in the area. And the school in Japan is in a rural area, so they didn't have much resources. I have some connections there in Japan because I teach study abroad trip in Japan. But unfortunately, while we started this research in the spring, the pandemic hit, and what happened next. So we have to pause this research and figure out how to complete the research differently. So I have not made much progress, but hopefully we will be able to continue, once things get back a little bit more normal. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the traveling with me to virtual world and back, and maybe someday we will have the opportunity to travel together, whether it's in real world or in virtual world. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for taking us on this journey, and you're going to see in the chat all sorts of comments, incredible, outstanding. Mary Haffley's comment about fearlessness. I've had the pleasure of going on this journey with you, and all those kind of it's a memory for me as I look at the work and the conversations that we had over time. But I've also had the privilege and the good fortune to physically travel with you to places. And that is another place where you are this fearlessness of trying things new, exploring, adventure, and the creativity that you bring to your work. So I'm just so pleased to see this presentation and the kind of comments that you have there. You have inspired many people. And I got to see the dance in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the INSEA, the International Society for Education Through Arts, just as we saw at the end of your presentation. With that, it's very close to 9, but I would really like to open for questions or comments. We will also see you tomorrow too, so we can pick up on that. But maybe there could be just a couple comments and questions that we could hear your voice, or you could put it in the chat if you'd like. Lots of territory that you brought in here. So if there might be a couple people who would like to speak out, and then we'll call it a night.
Karen, Christine, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You made a wonderful comment where you said fiction grants us entry into what is otherwise inaccessible. Grants us entry into what is otherwise inaccessible. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, that is actually a quote from Patricia Levin, who wrote a lot of the fictional research. I feel like fiction gives us a chance to be imaginative, be creative, And so when we do research in the real world, like I do in a classroom, there's something that I want to say, but it's sort of hard to describe or to write about, in this research. Then I can imagine a different situation. So like I open up a different world to talk about these things, so that's how I perceive how fiction can provide people with different ways to access, things that we are not normally accessible. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it certainly does, particularly with your examples. But and I also think that part of that is referenced by knowing what is accessible, and ultimately what is accessible is a little bit like what you talked about when you talked about traditional methodologies and practices of research, because generally what is accessible is what's been kind of reified and it's part of the discourse. It's examples of our scholarship and our publications and peer review. And it kind of gets back to a point I made earlier about sort of asking questions that we can't even, or raising questions we can't even think of. And sometimes you need to go outside of that space, which is what you did with your, starting your doctoral journey in terms of that real life virtual world nexus. And in that way, you kind of become a little bit unanchored to what might be accepted. So you're a little bit out there, but ultimately you need to bring that back into that field so that what we now know based on what you do helps us sort of challenge what we do know. And I think what's important in what you do is this dialectic or this interaction that this kind of work sets up, because it really does take us to another discourse space. And I think that that's why looking at some of your interactive work, your later work, is I really see that as a continuation of opening up that sort of discourse space. So wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.